Hello math application students, and welcome to your online lesson. Today we will learn to solve systems of linear equations with 3 or more variables. We will know we are successful when we can efficiently use technology to solve systems of equations with up to 3 variables. So we're going to jump right into looking at an example with 3 variables. Like we saw when we had systems of equations with 2 variables, we needed to have at least 2 equations. Well, with systems of 3 variables, we need to have 3 equations. And so that's what we've got here. Our 3 variables are the familiar x and y, as well as newcomer z. And again, they can be used with other letters as well, like A, B, C, or any 3 letters that are getting used in the problem. We've learned up to this point a variety of ways to solve systems of equations, including substitution, elimination, graphing, and using the Poly-Smilt application on the TI-84 calculators. You can solve systems of equations with 3 variables using most of these techniques. Elimination is a really good one, where you could get a single variable alone, for example, that x, and I would have to move this other stuff to the other side, and then I could plug in all of that stuff, including the y's and the z's, into these other 2 equations, essentially eliminating the x's. And then I would have 2 equations that have 2 variables each, and I could use any of the techniques that I'd had up to that point. Also, I could use elimination. If I did elimination, I would have to pick 2 pairs of equations, for example, the first 2 and the last 2. Well, looking at these last 2 right away, I could see that it'd be pretty easy for me to eliminate these x's. I would just have to multiply one of my equations by a -1 to essentially switch the sign of all of the terms. And then I could cancel out these x's efficiently and be left with something like this. And then I've got 2 variables. I could do the same thing with these top 2 equations, again, eliminating x, and be down to 2 variables. And then again, you could use any of the methods you want: Poly-Smilt, graphing on the calculator, substitution, or elimination. We're not going to do any of those, at least as far as those by hand methods. Again, you're welcome to do that. You're able to do that. It's a fun process to try to work your way through if you've never done it before and you're interested in solving math problems like that. But the way that we are going to focus on, and the way that would be appropriate for an IB test to maximize our efficiency, which means to both get it right and do it in a relatively quick manner, is to use our calculator. So right away, I'm going to pull up a TI-84 calculator, get this guy turned on, and we are going to go to the Poly-Smilt 2 application. So I'm going to hit the purple apps key, go to Poly-Smilt 2, which stands for Polynomial Simultaneous Solver, version 2, and hit enter to get to our main menu. Just like before, when we were using the Poly-Smilt app for 2 variables, we are going to choice 2, simultaneous equation solver. This time we just happen to have 3 simultaneous equations. So now in this next menu, this is where we have to pay a little bit more attention, especially if someone using our calculator before us was using a different number of unknowns. So we have not 2 but 3 equations. So we need to adjust and select using the enter key 3 equations. And then our number of unknowns, also known as our number of variables, is also 3. So we need to select that as well. So again, notice here that we've got these 2, the equations has moved up to 3, and the unknowns, which is our variable, has also moved up to 3. And then we're going to be hitting this next key, which is right here. And in order to do that, we use the F5 key, also known as the graph key. So we will hit that one. And then I get to this matrix menu, and you'll notice it's different than what we saw when we were solving 2 equations, because there are 3 rows and there are room for 3 coefficients before we get to our equal sign. Once again, this little vertical line here is like the equal sign. It replaces this right here. On the left side of that line, we are putting in all of our coefficients. We want to make sure that all 3 of our equations are in the same order, meaning that in this case it's like standard or alphabetical order, where we've got the x, then the y term, and then the z term. And that's true for the next one: x term, y term, z term, and then x term, y term, and z term. Like before, we won't be using any variables in our application. We are just putting in the coefficients To the left of that vertical line, 3 coefficients for each equation, and then the constant on the other side of the vertical line, or the answer if you want to think of it that way. So right away, I'm going to start with our first equation. Looking at my coefficients, I have a 2, I have a 4, I have an implied 1z, and then I finally have my constant or answer to that equation, which is 1. So I'm going to be entering those in. 2, enter. 4, enter. 1 for the z, enter, and then 1 as my constant. We'll do the same thing on the next line. This time we have 1x. Notice for the y, it's a negative term. So we have negative 2. Make sure to use the negative key at the bottom of the calculator. Negative 2, enter. Negative 3, enter. And then finally 2, enter. And lastly, for our last equation, mostly coefficients of 1 since there's no actual number written. So that'd be 1x, 1y, then negative 1 for the z, and finally our constant, which is negative 1. So just a few more buttons to hit because there are more coefficients to enter in. But other than that, pretty similar to what we've done before. We are now, again, going to go to solve. We're going to be using the F5 key, which is the graph key. And I hit the graph, and I get my answer. Now, like before, they're giving us an x1, an x2, an x3. We don't have x1, x2, or x3 in our equation. We have x, y, and z. So make sure that we are being careful when we actually write this down to label what we have found. What is our x? Well, our x is 5. Our y, which was our second variable, again, the calculator has labeled this as x2, but we are not calling it x2, we are calling it y, because that's the variable that we were trying to find. And then finally, our third variable, which they had labeled as x3, we are labeling as z. And you'll notice when I make my z's, I put a little slash through the middle of it so that it doesn't look like a 2. And I end up with a 3 for that. All right. I'm essentially done with this system of equation in 3 variables. But what I'd always like to do is check to make sure that I've done it correctly. Ideally, this should not work in just one, but all 3 of the equations. Obviously, if you check it in one, that's a good check, especially since the calculator did most of this work. It's unlikely that if it works in one, that it wouldn't work in the others, but we can check it in all 3. So on the calculator here, I'm going to quit out, and in order to do that, I'm just going to press second and then the mode button, which are these 2 keys here, second, and then the mode button, because right above mode, the second function is quit. And then I have to press that one more time, second, and then quit. And now I'm going to write my first equation in the calculator, everything up to the equal sign. And so I had 2x, again, looking at this equation right here, I have 2x. Well, what is my x? My x, we just found out, is 5. So I'm doing 2 times 5, and I'm replacing that x with the 5. So 2 times 5, or 2 parentheses 5, plus 4 times my y. Well, I just found out that my y is negative 3, so we will type in 4 times our negative 3, plus 1 times my z, or just plus my z, which is this 3 that we have right over here. So I'll type that in. And when I hit enter now, I should get the answer that's on the right side of this equation, which is a 1. So I'm going to hit enter, and voila, I got a 1. It all checked out. Again, we could do that for the remaining 2 equations, but I won't take up any more time on this video. But if I had the time on a test and I really wanted to make sure that everything was correct and working out, I'd check it in all 3 to make sure that everything is rock solid and that my solution, which is this ordered triple, 5, -3, 3, works in all 3 of the equations. All right, until next time.